The gavel cracked like thunder, jolting the courtroom into silence, and Judge Whitmore said, "Order in the court." A water pitcher trembled, spilling onto polished wood, while whispers hissed across the gallery. Margaret Cole, the prosecutor, leaned forward with sharp eyes, and Daniel Hale, the defense attorney, tightened his grip on the table edge. On the witness stand, Edward Grant, a frail man with hollowed cheeks, trembled as he blurted, "The wealth you see was born of blood." A juror gasped, her hand clutching the armrest, and a reporter's pen froze mid-stroke. The defendant, Thomas Hale, shifted uneasily, his pulse hammering. He felt history's shadow pressing down, every secret of his family dragging him toward ruin. The air thickened, heavy with dread, as if truth itself had been shackled and forced to rise. Everyone sensed it. The trial had just become more than law. It was a reckoning. Thomas Hale's fear was not of prison bars, but of a name tainted by shadows. He thought, "They don't see me. They see my bloodline." His pulse thundered as whispers swirled, painting him guilty before evidence spoke. Reporters scribbled eagerly, their pens chasing his downfall. His lawyer whispered, "Stay calm," but Thomas's breath came shallow, the weight of his ancestors pressing like chains. Every eye bore into him, not for what he had done, but for sins buried in graves decades old. Margaret Cole rose, her voice cutting through the silence. Margaret said, "This fortune is soaked in betrayal." The jury stiffened as she gestured toward ancestral portraits looming above. Every brick of the Hale Empire was built on deceit, she pressed. Thomas's stomach twisted, the painted eyes of dead relatives glaring down like accusers. Daniel Hale rose sharply, protesting, objection. Irrelevant. But the judge's gavel struck once, silencing the moment. The trial was shifting. This was no longer about evidence, but inheritance of guilt. Daniel Hale countered with clenched teeth, words sharp and deliberate. Daniel said, "This is not about legacy. It's about law." He turned toward the jury, voice steady, pulling their gaze from the past. But the gallery's whispers persisted, more enthralled by sins than statutes. Thomas watched, torn between hope and despair, as his defender faced a storm of suspicion. Judge Whitmore's brow furrowed, and Thomas realized the trial might slip away before it even began. The true battle raged inside Thomas Hale, his breath catching as the jury's eyes pinned him. He thought, "Every word condemns me, every silence too." He sat in a storm of judgment, gavel echoes pounding in his skull. Reporters scratched furiously, headlines forming in real time. Thomas clenched his fists under the table, nails digging deep as if pain could anchor him. No defense could erase the whispering truth. Guilt was inherited like property. The trial was not a case but a reckoning of blood. The courtroom projector flickered, illuminating a wall of faded portraits. Margaret Cole said, "Behold the Hale legacy," her voice dripping with accusation. Generations of faces stared down, painted smiles unable to hide histories of greed and violence. The jury shifted, some glancing nervously at Thomas Hale, as if his features carried echoes of those in the frames. The narrator revealed that Thomas felt his chest tighten, his family's fortune no longer gold, but a chain of ghosts binding him to sins he never chose. The weight of inheritance pressed heavier than iron shackles. Margaret Cole continued, her tone deliberate. Margaret said, "Blood carries memory, and guilt cannot be buried." The jurors exchanged uneasy glances, their hands fidgeting with pens and notepads. The narrator described Thomas Hale, staring downward, nails biting into his palms under the table, his silence louder than words. Daniel Hale muttered, "This is theater, not law," but his voice fell flat. The courtroom leaned in, gripped not by evidence but by myth. History had been weaponized, and Thomas realized he was fighting not for innocence but for identity itself. The back doors creaked open, drawing all eyes as Claire Hale entered, the estranged daughter whose absence had been whispered about for years. The narrator noted her presence cut through the chamber like a blade, her gaze locked on Thomas. Thomas thought, "She came to watch me fall." Reporters scribbled furiously, delighted by the twist. Margaret Cole smiled faintly, as if welcoming a secret weapon. Daniel Hale's face darkened, muttering, "This will destroy us." The air quivered with expectation. Blood was about to testify against blood. Outside the courthouse, the crowd roared as reporters broadcast the scandal. The narrator described microphones thrust toward anyone connected to the Hales, headlines flashing across digital screens. Legacy of blood. Gossip bled into news, and truth drowned in spectacle. Inside, Thomas Hale could almost hear the chants seeping through the stone walls. He thought, "The verdict will be written before the jury speaks." Margaret Cole knew the press was her silent ally, feeding fear into the veins of the public. The trial was now theater for an entire nation. Back inside, the narrator revealed Thomas Hale's realization. It was not only his body on trial, but his name. He thought, "They judge me for a past I never lived." Every whisper felt like a verdict, every look like condemnation. Margaret Cole smirked, sensing her strategy sinking into the jury's bones. Daniel Hale whispered, "We fight facts, not ghosts," but his own eyes betrayed doubt. The courtroom became a stage where bloodlines testified louder than words, and Thomas felt his fate closing in like a door with no key. The witness chair creaked as Detective Harris shifted uneasily, his testimony cracking under pressure. He muttered, "I may have misread the records." The courtroom gasped, tension snapping like wire. Margaret Cole pounced, her voice slicing. "You swore under oath. Was your investigation careless or corrupt?" The jurors exchanged glances, their pens pausing mid-note. Thomas Hale's chest pounded. Each contradiction pulled him deeper into suspicion. Daniel Hale rose, demanding, "Answer directly." The narrator observed the courtroom rippling with disbelief, every word feeding doubt like poison into the air. Daniel Hale pressed forward, his voice booming. Daniel said, "This case hinges on your records, Detective. One lie here corrupts everything." Harris stammered, sweat dripping onto the polished wood. Margaret Cole snapped, "Objection! Badgering!" Judge Whitmore's gavel cracked, his stern eyes narrowing. The narrator described Thomas Hale's stomach twisting, his fate tangled in sloppy details of evidence. A single mistake was enough to damn him. The gallery buzzed, restless, their whispers swelling like a tide. The trial was no longer a battle of law, but a spectacle of flaws. The fixer, Leonard Briggs, shuffled in, his cufflinks glinting under courtroom lights. The narrator revealed his reputation, a man who thrived in shadows, making dirty secrets disappear. Margaret Cole smirked, asking, "Tell us about the favors you arranged for the Hale family." Leonard chuckled darkly. "Which decade?" Gasps erupted. Reporters scribbled furiously. Thomas Hale's heart plunged, realizing decades of cover-ups were being dragged into daylight. Daniel Hale slammed his palm against the table, hissing, "This is character assassination." But the jury leaned forward, devouring every word. As Leonard Briggs spoke, the jurors exchanged uneasy looks. One whispered to another, eyebrows raised. The narrator described the way of their shifting gazes. Thomas Hale could feel them judging not just his case, but his bloodline. A juror's hand trembled, pen hovering above the page before dropping soundlessly. Margaret Cole leaned in, saying, "The truth always finds its way out." Thomas thought, "They're not listening to the law. They're listening to ghosts." The silence between words grew heavier than gavel strikes, suffocating the air itself. Suddenly, Thomas Hale erupted, his voice cutting through the chamber. Thomas shouted, "This is a circus! I am not my ancestors!" Gasps exploded as Judge Whitmore slammed his gavel, bellowing order. Reporters leapt to their feet, pens racing, cameras flashing like lightning. Margaret Cole smirked, murmuring finally, "The mask cracks." Daniel Hale grabbed Thomas's arm, whispering urgently, "You're giving them what they want." The narrator revealed Thomas's chest heaving, his anger spilling into the open, becoming fuel for the very fire consuming him. The courtroom lights dimmed as a stack of yellowed letters was carried in, sealed with wax and dust. Margaret Cole announced, "These letters belong to the Hale patriarch." Gasps rippled as the first page revealed deals inked in blood and greed. The narrator described Thomas Hale's face tightening, his father's name scrawled across signatures like a curse. Daniel Hale rose, shouting, "This is inadmissible." But Judge Whitmore's gavel struck, declaring, "Let the record be read." History's ghosts were no longer whispers. They were evidence carved into ink. The narrator revealed a hushed gasp as Margaret Cole read aloud. Affairs, bribes, and betrayals scripted by the Hale family generations past. Her voice trembled with controlled triumph. Thomas Hale's hands shook under the table, hearing sins that bore his name but not his choices. A juror leaned forward, eyes wide, lips pursed as if swallowing judgment too heavy to hold back. Daniel Hale pressed his hand flat on the table, his face taut with fury, knowing the damage was irreversible. The courtroom erupted when Margaret Cole produced a forged will, its ink smeared but clear enough to upend inheritance. She declared the Hale fortune was stolen. Reporters leapt to their feet, flashes exploding like lightning storms. The narrator described Thomas Hale's lips parting in horror, the will unraveling the very ground he stood on. Daniel Hale shouted, "Forgery! Lies!" But the judge's stern glare silenced him. The jury sat frozen, torn between disbelief and fascination. A legacy thought untouchable now lay shattered on parchment. In the gallery, Claire Hale rose suddenly, her voice trembling yet sharp. Claire said, "You all want truth? Our family has been rotting from the inside for decades." Murmurs swelled, reporters scribbling furiously. The narrator described Thomas Hale staring at her, his jaw clenched, betrayal cutting deeper than accusation. Margaret Cole's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. This was testimony she didn't even need to solicit. Daniel Hale barked, "Sit down, Claire." But the damage had been done. The family was eating itself alive under oath. The narrator revealed realization dawning on Daniel Hale. This was no longer about legal statutes but morality itself. He whispered to Thomas Hale, "They're not convicting you. They're convicting your name." Thomas felt his chest cave under the weight, Claire's betrayal echoing like thunder. The jurors' faces turned grave, their eyes reflecting disgust at a dynasty collapsing before them. Margaret Cole closed her folder with a sharp snap, the sound echoing like a nail sealing a coffin. Silence lingered, heavier than any verdict. The courtroom fell silent as Eleanor Hale, Thomas's aunt, took the stand. Her smile was warm, but her words cold. Eleanor said, "Thomas was never fit to carry this family's name." Gasps echoed as she painted him not as heir but as usurper. The narrator described Thomas' chest burning, betrayal twisting deeper than any prosecutor's blade. Daniel Hale muttered, "She's their puppet," but the jury leaned forward, enthralled by family cannibalism. Margaret Cole folded her arms, her plan unfolding perfectly. Blood had turned against blood. The silent victim finally spoke, her voice trembling yet searing. Laura Benton said, "I stayed silent because fear kept me chained. But the truth is the Hales buried what they could not erase." Reporters nearly fell over themselves to catch every word. The narrator observed Thomas Hale's hands trembling, his eyes darting toward Laura as though begging for mercy. Daniel Hale rose to object, but Judge Whitmore silenced him with a glare. Thomas thought her silence was safer than her words. The silence ended, and with it his defense crumbled further. A ripple tore through the chamber as juror number 6 was exposed. Margaret Cole declared, "This juror once worked for Hale Industries." The man froze, face drained, as murmurs swelled. The narrator described Thomas Hale's stomach plunging. Justice had never been blind. It had been bought and placed beside him. Daniel Hale erupted. "This is grounds for mistrial." Judge Whitmore's gavel slammed, demanding order, but the jury's impartial mask had shattered. The trial itself now stood accused, and every glance at Thomas carried suspicion doubled in weight. The double-agent investigator was called to testify, his voice smooth but heavy with secrets. He said, "I fed both sides because survival demands compromise." Gasps rippled across the chamber. The narrator described Margaret Cole's satisfied grin, while Daniel Hale's fists clenched on the table. Thomas Hale whispered to himself, "Everyone has sold me." The jury sat rapt, watching betrayal unfold as if it were theater. The courtroom was no longer a chamber of law, but a stage where loyalty was shredded in the name of survival. The narrator revealed the final twist of betrayal. Thomas Hale's closest ally, Daniel Hale, his own cousin and lawyer, had concealed evidence. Margaret Cole's voice rang, "Your defense hid this document." She slid a folder across the table. Daniel's face froze, his silence damning. Thomas's voice cracked, "You knew?" The room buzzed with shock as betrayal struck deeper than any accusation. The jury stared, no longer at evidence, but at a family collapsing from within. In that moment, Thomas was left alone, abandoned even by his defender. Margaret Cole rose with the force of a storm, her closing argument sharp as a blade. She said, "The Hales built their empire on lies, and today, justice demands we tear it down." Her words struck like hammer blows, every syllable echoing through the chamber. The narrator described jurors leaning forward, eyes narrowed, caught in her rhythm. Thomas Hale sat frozen, his chest aching as her words branded him with the sins of his fathers. Margaret's voice rose higher, each phrase wrapping like a noose around his name. Daniel Hale stood for his closing, voice low at first, then rising. Daniel said, "This trial is not about bloodlines. It is about one man." His gaze locked on Thomas Hale. The narrator revealed Thomas's hands trembling, desperate for salvation in his cousin's words. Daniel pleaded, "Do not punish him for ghosts. Punish only proof." The jury shifted uneasily, doubt flickering across faces. Margaret Cole smirked, her confidence unshaken. Outside, rain hammered the courthouse windows, thunder echoing the storm within. The narrator described Margaret Cole's rebuttal, her voice venomous. Margaret said, "You cannot separate Thomas Hale from his family because he profited from their crimes." Gasps rippled through the gallery as her fingers stabbed the air toward him. Thomas felt his throat tighten, sweat trickling down his neck. Reporters scribbled wildly, knowing headlines were already written. Daniel slammed his palm against the table, but his voice faltered, drowned by Margaret's moment. The trial was no longer law. It was theater, and Margaret was winning the stage. The narrator revealed how emotion tore through the gallery as voices cracked with anger and despair. A woman shouted, "The Hales ruined this town." Bailiffs rushed to silence the eruption, but the courtroom had already caught fire. Thomas Hale sat with his head bowed, every word piercing like a blade. Daniel whispered, "Hold on," but Thomas's chest felt crushed under centuries of hate. Judge Whitmore's gavel thundered. The chaos drowned him. The trial was no longer a hearing. It had become an execution by public voice. The narrator captured the moment the trial imploded. Ward Grant, frail and trembling, stood again, voice breaking. Edward cried, "It wasn't Thomas. It was me. I forged the will." Silence crushed the room before erupting into shouts. Thomas Hale's head snapped upward, disbelief flooding his eyes. Margaret Cole's face drained of triumph, while Daniel Hale whispered, "This changes everything." The jury gasped, their notes forgotten. The confession detonated in the chamber like dynamite, shattering alliances and rewriting the trial in one breath. The narrator described a silence that felt eternal as the jury filed back in, eyes grave, shoulders heavy. Judge Whitmore asked, "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman rose, voice steady but thick. "We have." Thomas Hale gripped the edge of the defense table, his knuckles white. Margaret Cole's lips curved faintly, certain of victory. Daniel Hale whispered, "Breathe, Thomas." The room seemed to hold its breath, the weight of generations pressing against one fragile moment. The foreman spoke on the charge of fraud. "We find the defendant not guilty." Gasps erupted, some in relief, others in outrage. But his pause cut deeper than any word. "On the charge of conspiracy, we find guilty." The narrator revealed Thomas Hale's knees buckling, his fate split down the middle, absolved of one crime yet condemned by another. Margaret Cole's eyes glimmered, her victory partial but devastating. Daniel Hale closed his eyes, whispering, "We lost the soul of it." The narrator captured Claire Hale rising, her voice trembling with conflict. Claire said, "I thought truth would set me free, but it feels like I've chained us all." Reporters scribbled furiously, delighted by her anguish. Thomas Hale stared at her, betrayal and sorrow mixing in his eyes. Margaret Cole said, "Your honesty saved the record, if not the family." Claire's shoulders sagged, and for a moment she looked more victim than witness. Thomas whispered, "You gave them my blood." Silence stretched between them, heavier than chains. Outside, cameras flashed like lightning storms as reporters shouted over one another. The narrator described Thomas Hale emerging in handcuffs, rain pouring down, his name screamed in headlines. Some shouted justice, while others cried shame. Daniel Hale walked beside him, jaw clenched, his silence heavier than words. Margaret Cole addressed microphones with calm triumph. This was justice for the past and the present. The courthouse steps became a stage, and Thomas Hale the unwilling actor in the spectacle of legacy. The narrator revealed Thomas Hale pausing as he was led into the police van. He whispered, "I never chose this blood, but it chose me." Reporters froze, pens stilled by the weight of his word. Claire Hale stood in the distance, tears cutting her cheeks, guilt etching her features. Margaret Cole closed her umbrella, turning away victorious. Daniel Hale whispered, "History devours us all." As the van door slammed, silence fell. The legacy of the Hales had ended not with wealth, but with ruin carved in rain.